Almost, yes. So, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us today. We have the great pleasure of having with us today Anne-Nelly Perret-Clemont, who is close to us now, but she has been someone who has helped us learn about argumentation from a Vygotskian perspective, which is an essential issue for us all. We have tried hard to follow what she writes and how she writes about different topics, because she has a very important also contribution for the area in learning and discussing about kids and teens learning how to argument. Anne-Nelly Perret-Clemont studied psychology with Jean Piaget in the University of Geneva. She worked also with the University of Lausanne on children development in the Institute of Education at the University of London. She conducts research in social and cultural psychology with a special interest for the study of thinking as a contextualized and developmental activity. She has been interested in the transition from youth to adulthood with special attention to vocational training. She's presently coordinating an interdisciplinary project on knowledge-oriented argumentation. She has been involved in educational research and teacher training, member of several committees for science policy, co-founder and co-presenter of DORE, an action of the Swiss National Science Foundation to support field-oriented research in social, health, and educational science, and in art and music. Anne-Nelly Perret-Clemont is also a member of the ISCAR Society, and with this, she has helped us learn a lot from different areas and have, perhaps for me at least, a more Vygotskian view of Piaget. So I thank you very much. I'm very happy that my students and my friends and all the people who are here participating today can have a chance also to talk to you, to discuss with you and learn more from you. Thank you very much. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. So hello to everyone. I'm very sorry not to speak Portuguese. I understand a few words, I can read it a little better, but the pronunciation I've never managed. I should take lessons and learn properly. But it's really a pleasure. I'm sorry to be at a distance, but that's so much better than nothing. I mean, it's great. And I thank you. Are you saying something?
I'm sorry, Anne-Nelly, I forgot to tell people who want to have Portuguese translation to go to the bottom part of your screen and press in interpretation and put Portuguese for you there. Então, aqueles de vocês que precisam de interpretação, vão até a parte de baixo da tela e em interpretação, coloquem português. Aí vocês vão poder ter a gravação em português, tá certo? Obrigada. Okay. Sorry, Anne-Nelly.
That's right. Thank you very much. So I was saying, sorry to speak English, which is neither your language nor mine, because I'm French speaking, living in a country where there are 4 national languages, German, French, Italian, and Romansh. And so, in fact, we don't speak any language properly, because each time we try to talk, the audience is partly of another language. So we simplify our language, we try to adapt, we develop a sort of local dialect that's capable of bridging to other languages. But now we are in English, so that's even worse. Thank you so much, Fernanda, for inviting me. And thank you for all those who have sent me your preguntas, which are questions that I have read and studied. As you might have understood from the presentation, I'm interested in social psychology, cultural psychology, but as means to study development. And presently I'm very much interested in dialogue, and so it sort of inhibits me when I try to talk, because lecture is not a dialogue. So I told that to Fernanda several times, and this is why I'm so happy to have these questions, because then I can try. Of course, I have not even traveled to meet you in Brazil. I've been to Recife, but I haven't been south. And so I have to imagine plenty of things. I'm certainly wrong. So instead of imagining, I much prefer that I have your questions, and then I can ask you if I don't understand what you are making a reference to. So maybe to introduce myself a little bit, less formally than the brilliant discourse that Fernanda has done. Myself, I was born in Belgium, and then I grew up in several countries, in France, in the United States, in Italy, in Switzerland. So I'm sort of used to live in different cultural contexts. Well, it's now not very exotic. I've been to China and Japan or to Africa, but I've never lived over there. But I have lived in several educational systems. I went to school in different places, and that was a major experience for me, because each school system is certain that it's the best and that they know what knowledge is, history is, literature is. But when you, as a child, change school system, you get some perspective on this perspective. There are some clashes, some contradictions. And certainly that has arose part of my interests for education. Education also often presented as absolute, and then when you have to adapt to different rules and procedures and assessment and so on, and curricula, you don't think they are absolutes anymore. I have also been quite involved when I was young into youth movements. As a child, as a teenager, and then being active in managing camps and encounters and multicultural. I was careful to always invite children from other languages. And so that has been part of what I had done before studying psychology. But because of that experience, I didn't know if I want to study psychology or social work or education or being a teacher. I was interested in all these directions. And finally, I studied psychology because Piaget was around. And the university was 15 kilometers away from my home, so it was quite advisable to study psychology rather than anything else, because one of the main figures was teaching there. And I think it was a good choice, because it is an experience in itself to meet someone with such a large culture and doing interesting work. I don't think that I mean, I've always been slightly or quite critical of what he was teaching, but it was quite a challenge to understand it, to take the stance toward it, to discuss it. And for that, I'm very thankful. I was studying psychology, but I went to follow some classes in philosophy, sociology, education, because of my interest. And then for my PhD, I had been also doing a master in London. For my PhD, I tried to put together ideas from Piaget and ideas from Vygotsky. I finished my PhD in '76. Vygotsky was not very much known in the West. There was a sort of taboo. Looking east was politically dangerous, but not really dangerous, taboo. It's something you just don't do. And and my supervisor, Willem Dwijs, we thought that it was important for many reasons, for child development, because of the interest of Vygotsky's ideas, also because Vygotsky was an early interlocutor to Piaget, and vice versa. And Vygotsky translated Piaget in the 20s in Russian, or had Piaget translated in Russian and published him. So they were in close interaction. We also thought that politically in the 70s, it was very important to reach out to the East and try to do something to go beyond the Cold War and try to, in Europe, had an hemiplegia. Half of Europe was East and half of Europe was West. And we thought it was culturally and socially and politically important to bridge. So that was also some of the reason. Also, Piaget taught us a lot of things that are very interesting, stemming from biology and moving to psychology, but that we were lacking perspectives from sociology. Well, he was also a professor of sociology, but his understanding of sociology was quite abstract. And I had interest in sociology and anthropology, and in my dissertation, I tried to get these perspectives together, and to make it short, I would say, I tried to show that the kind of psychological development that Piaget had described could be partly explained by the social interactions that kids are involved in. And Piaget had somehow already said that, but with experimental methods that he was not using, I devised experiments in which I provoked the change of stages of kids because of the social interactions that they had experienced. And so I got my PhD, but I was not very satisfied with this result, except that it gave me a PhD, because I couldn't believe that within 10, 15 minutes of, sometimes even 5 minutes, of social interactions, you could have such an impact as to change stage. So I had in mind that probably some of the kids were already in sort of the zone of proximal development of the stage, and that something helped them to perform better. And I wanted to understand what was that. And that brought me into studying communication. What was going on in the communication between the kids who were interacting that provoked this sort of new understandings that were explained as change in stage. So studying these processes of communication with many colleagues, in the meantime, I had made networks of colleagues who were concerned with the same type of issues. Well, maybe I say also that in the 70s, I'm not sure that has changed a lot now, but in those days it was quite pregnant to always explain children's unsuccess in school, to explain school failure by what they used to call socio-cultural handicap, and to try to have compensatory education to bridge the gap. And in my data, I was not finding a socio-cultural handicap. I was finding a difference between children of different social classes, but that could be overcome in 5 to 10 minutes on the given task. Not going to change their life, but you can change their performance in school, in this school-like task. And this meant that it was not a handicap. It was a matter of communication. Something was in the relationship between the experimenter and the kids. Something was making it more difficult for some of the kids than for others. So I went into studying the type of conversations that are established between adults and kids. And I also tried to understand the types of conversations between the kids. And there, to make it short, you have you can polarize. There is a whole scale of behaviors, but at one end you have the teachers, or sometimes the kids, who behave like teachers, and they speak with authority and they know what is right, and they make lessons and they assess what the other says. That's one extreme. And at the other extreme, you have the kids who are puzzled, who have an opinion, maybe they don't dare say it, but they have it. And they try to understand what is the game there, what they are expected to do. And maybe they are with a friend who has the same attitude. And then there is a sort of verbal communication that's not very explicit, but in which they confront their perspectives without knowing who is right. They have to go beyond the difference to try to solve the problem. And that's what I really got thrilled by, is when you can have a thinking activity that is not appropriating what the other says. It's not just grasping what the other says, but it's try to understand the issue, try to understand how to solve it. And you don't pretend to be right, you don't play the teacher, but you don't either pretend to be wrong. I mean, that's not the problem, being right or wrong. The problem is to solve the problem. And in that, you coordinate with your peers to try to find a way out. And that was, for me, exemplary thinking, because it was thinking around the subject matter and having opportunities to decenter, to see that your own perspective is not the only one, but then to solve the puzzle of what do you do with these different perspectives to get to finish the task. And this brought me to this experimental, well, the data there was both qualitative and quantitative. From the quantitative point of view, I could establish that children progressed. Okay. But from the qualitative point of view, I wanted to understand what were the processes involved that made them progress. And that's why I found that kids were developing or learning, as you want, if they were confronting different perspectives than their own without knowing which one was right and having to sort it out themselves. And one of the results was that we could observe kids who were learning from other kids that know less than themselves. Because it didn't matter, in fact, how much they know. The problem was how they put together what they know to find a solution. And in the meantime, while I was doing my research on these topics, I visited schools to gather my data and so on, but I became friends with the teachers. And I was very lucky because I was in schools where teachers had grouped to do active learning. They wanted to have an active school, and as the staff of these two schools I was in did a lot of work inspired by Freinet of progressive education to devise techniques to improve their teaching. And as I was around, each time there was a pause or recess, they started discussing with me, you're the psychologist, what do you think about that? And so we discussed a lot from their perspective as teachers and from my perspective as researcher in psychology. And that's one of the places where I strongly experienced a back and forth between theory and practice. Not only theory that inspires practice, but also how the observations that you do while you practice your experience can come and confront the theory and ask for a modification of the theory, ask for new theoretical understanding. So it's in the sake of the advancements of practice, but also of theory. And in our journeys in psychology, I have the feeling that we very often have the same in education, theories, and you sort of deduce the practice, but we very seldom have people who say, okay, that's your theory, but from the field, what I see when I act like this and like that doesn't fit completely into your theory. This has to be worked again on. It challenges the theory that has to move on. So from the experience in education, I was really motivated to challenge some of Piaget's positions. But I also wanted to understand why Piaget had these positions. And that made me prepare a book from a Vygotskian perspective, taking Piaget as a subject, not Piaget as a theoretician. Piaget as a man who had grown up in Neuchâtel, the city where I married and came to live. And I did some kind of anthropology and history with historians to understand what was the intellectual, social, political milieu in which Piaget had grown, to try to understand how this child and teenager was confronted within his own zone of development by other persons who invited him to discover resources, to think beyond his present thinking. And it is very interesting to discover all the people that have influenced Piaget, and how, in fact, he says he's a genius. I think he's a genius in picking up other people's ideas and making something out of it. So now that I know who were his teachers, who were his professors, who were his schoolmates, I can, and in which times he lived, World War I, the almost civil war in Switzerland, but it didn't turn into a civil war, but it was a very risky moment after the First World War, then the Second World War, and then this hemiplegia east-west in Europe, and the fear of communism, etc. It's very interesting to see how he continued to do the kind of research he wanted to do, using some cultural elements and not others within given situations. So not Piaget in abstracto, but Piaget in the field of his time. And from there on, I thought, well, we are all doing the same thing as Piaget did. We are working in our field, in our time, with our needs, with our inspirations, with the taboos around, with the emotions and fears around, with goals that we choose for our life or that are pushed on us. And how do we manage our way? And I think that's something very common with said with different words, but very common to the project of Fernanda, trying to see how in education we can approach people as interlocutors who have their own experience, who have something they would like to do, share, express experience, and how the communication can be established there, and how it increases the agency of the person or how it represses it, and what can be done then collectively when the society is made up of persons who are in this attitude. And well, I'm French speaking, so of course I was trained by the French tradition in psychology and education, but I was very quickly very interested by psychology in Scandinavia. That's another bunch of small countries that don't need to be colonized immediately by one of the major languages of Europe. And I thought I liked the critical perspectives, very well informed, critical and very active perspectives I could find in some of the Scandinavian and Finnish colleagues. I liked, of course, what I discovered around Vygotsky and the Russian psychology. And then in Southern Europe, I was very interested by the work done in Spain, Portugal, and Italy. Well, Spain and Portugal, it was only at the end of the 70s that psychology was really established in the universities, because the fascist country were not allowed to, the dictatorship did not allow for psychology. But when they managed to have a voice in psychology, they were very much concerned in doing work that was relevant for social life. So they did a lot of work with social work, psychology together, and education together. In those days, that was true also in the city of London. There was a lot of progressive education in London in the very late 60s, early 70s, because there were many migrant children. With the decolonization process, a large amount of population from the previous colonies came to London with their families. And this was a shock on the school system. And their first reaction was really to adapt to the situation and do, with a lot of creativity, plenty of very interesting things. Unfortunately, Mrs. Thatcher came in, and she didn't have a lot of empathy for this. And the conservative view of people who think they know what education is started prevailing. But I had been lucky enough to visit at least 50 schools and to get along from those practices. So, well, maybe still a few other words. When I think my main object of study is cognitive processes, but not cognitive processes limited to brain processes. Of course, without a brain, we will have some difficulty. I acknowledge that fully. But we are not only a brain. We are a body with relationships, with will, with intentions, with emotions. But in my way, during my career, I had the feeling that very often people who were really concerned with progressive education tended to forget the cognitive processes, because as if cognitive processes were the property of the conservative, the traditional, the meaningless kind of formal teaching. And I am convinced that thinking is a very important tool also to change society. I mean, how can you change society without thinking? You always have in your own work this meta-reflection. Well, it's essential, but it is reflection. It is something that has to do with cognition. Not only cognition, cognition is never isolated, but if you take all the rest and you forget cognition, you get a strange mixture of primitive behaviors. And it's difficult to manage violence if there is no thinking. You sometimes have to suspend the action, not to act, in order to reflect on how you act. And this term reflect is essential. Yeah. And this idea also that I'm a person of action, I like to act, but sometimes it's better not to act and to observe, or to reflect and to reflect on the observations, to distance oneself from the present situation in order to be able to imagine alternatives. And alternatives can be imagined in many ways. You stop acting with your own group and you go to another group and you face other alternatives, or you stop reasoning alone on your math problem and you try to share your reasoning with a friend. And this activity of stopping, distancing, and then reflecting, I think is really part of the development. But the development of individuals and action in society. But it's not easy at all. And this brought me to study the spaces for thinking, the thinking spaces. Under which condition do people take the risk of reflecting? Because it's a risk. You might discover that you don't like what you are doing, or you might discover your identity is not the one it's not perceived the way you perceived it, or you never know what you'll discover when you start thinking. So it requires some trust. It requires some kind of confidence. And I think it requires support groups. You have to be part of a group or have educators or friends in a community that leaves the space for thinking. And this is difficult. For instance, well, I had a doctoral student called Marcelo Giglio from Argentina, who studied in Argentina, in Brazil, in Switzerland, how to help music teachers create spaces for kids to be creative. Because music lessons, he didn't want to have music lessons. He's a musician. He didn't want to have music lesson top down, you know, you have to do this and so on. He really wanted to have kids as active in the school as they are in their backyard when they do music as their friends. So how create the space in school for that? And well, he offered some kind of steps to promote that, but a main problem was the teachers' behavior. Because the teachers in those 3 countries, differently, for different reasons, had a hard time not behaving as control persons. They seem to be deeply afraid that kids do things wrong. They seem, for some, they are so much inspected by their authorities that they want only a perfect classroom with perfect performances, but also they have interiorized this within the profession, I think. And we really had to thought of how to manage teachers' anxiety when kids become creative, because they lose control. But control, you know, not control that they would devastate the classroom, whatever. No, just control that the way they write the melody is not the proper way. And so we had to help them laugh a little bit about what they wanted to control so much, and to reflect on how you learn. And you also learn by trials and errors. And if you don't leave a space for that, then it's not possible to learn. So it's really the role of the teacher that was transformed by this thinking about the space for thinking, the space for learning. Space in the sense physical, but also relational and also institutional. Because I could see, for instance, when I was in Geneva working with these teachers in progressive schools, that they were trying things, but then they had their parents becoming anxious about what was going on in schools, and then the school authorities becoming anxious because the parents were anxious and so on. And so it means the institution also has to be an object of concern to manage the relationships, what I described in my paper, Spaces for Thinking there, as the 4 levels. What happens at the level of the individual teacher who is anxious, what happens in the relationship between the teacher and her colleagues, and the teacher and the parents, and the teacher and the kids, and then what happens at the institutional level. What is the role of the teacher in the parents' minds, in the school authorities' minds, in the kids' minds, and how can that be transformed? And then at the ideological level, what is knowledge, what is creativity, what is education? There might be divergent perspective at the ideological level that make communication very difficult for daily life in the classroom. So that's the things I kind of worked on. Now, all that brought me back, and finished with that, to study argumentation. Because I have my intuition is that the mind is an argumentative mind. Not to well, sometimes to convince the others, but already for to convince yourself, or to coordinate the group work. And in fact, the mind can only be argumentative because it can never be sure. You don't find a scientist now talking about COVID with 100% assurance of what's saying. It's much more complex. So if you are a true scientist, you are humble. You know that you don't know everything. The best you can do is to make some assertions as provisional and argue what are the arguments presently, what are the arguments for such a statement. And so I'm very motivated in studying the argumentative individual and collective mind. Well, I stop here because I think it's time to open the dialogue and turn to the questions.
That's fabulous, Anne-Nelly, because you actually are bringing to us points that have to do with the idea of decolonization from the specific perspective of thinking about school and how colonized the relationships are, so that people expect students to reproduce ideas and not to create. And when you bring the idea of argumentation, it seems to me that what you're saying is we need to change the way school is organized, in the sense of someone who has the knowledge and puts this to the kids, and something that is created through argumentative processes of listening to the other and trying to integrate ideas. I even mentioned to Christina, who is here, but is also somewhere else because she's teaching now or at school, I don't know. But I was talking to her that was her point. How can we build with the kids this connection that they see themselves as people who have ideas, who can present ideas, who can expose ideas, but also kids who have different ideas, and they are not opposing ideas necessarily. Maybe they are, but they are not like antagonists in the sense that they may create something out of the differences. And we've been talking about differences in decolonized perspective a lot, about interculturality a lot, but how do we create it? How do we enact interculturality in our language environment? Because we are in a language environment. Here is a language environment. How do we put our differences together in an intercultural way? I think that your proposal brings to us this possibility of thinking interculturally in very concrete terms through argumentation. I don't know what you think. I'm just putting this question now because I was motivated by your speech. I don't know if that's what you think, but it connects too much to me with what we have been discussing. I don't know if anyone else.
I think it connects a lot. First, as someone said, or maybe it's you in the questions, the first point is to respect the others. If you don't have respect for the others, I mean, the battle is lost. The first thing is to gain respect, because with no respect, there isn't any education. The first thing is to gain respect. And that's also a matter of power. I mean, if the game is only that the one most powerful crushes the other one, then there is no space for education. That's at least no space in relation with the powerful group. But another thing very important is that argumentation, if it's only considered as a means to win a debate or as a means to persuade the others, then it's a political game. It's not education. And probably, and that's difficult, to do education, in political education, in a very deep sense, bring you the tools to be an active and responsible citizen, but not as a defense of one political option. Because if it's only the dogmatic defense of one political option, then it's again a matter of who wins in the debate, and who wins in the debate, especially now with the present media, is the most powerful one. So in fact, we want to go beyond this ideological fights that exist, but they are not the only level of reality. There are other levels that have to be articulated with them. And this requires to discover that you cannot do anything else that argue if you want to, well, the term in English doesn't work. Argue in English doesn't work because it's a very negative term that means quarreling. No, you have to use argumentation if you want to think. But not only because you want to, the goal is not to win, saying I have the best opinion, the best idea. The idea is to test your idea through argumentation with the others. What do you think of my prediction that this remedy could help those who have the disease of the COVID? Well, it's not I have the solution, it's what do you think about it? And you have good arguments for and against, and is it worth investing research there and so on. And I think this is also, if you want to repair a city, the idea of democracy is that you solve problems by confronting ideas and arguments, but not in the sense of who wins, but in the sense of increasing the space of reasoning to find the best solution. And I think that's really something that can be taught in schools. Of course, schools have another aim, also in theory at least, is to have common knowledge for the group or the nation, or so that people can speak the same language, count in the same way, do their trades and so on. But this aim presently takes too much space in the school and doesn't leave the space for the creativity. Because if you leave the space for creativity, of course, the kids will want to know what others have thought already on how to count and how to write and so on. But then it's with a purpose. If you just teach it because it's a must as a common ground of society, then he thinks, but I don't want to be part of this society, the teenagers will say. So that's not a reason. I think Vygotsky also, Piaget insisted a lot on the child's own agency in learning and the child's own activity as the source of learning. And somehow the teachers in Geneva didn't like Piaget because they said he doesn't leave us any space for our profession. If the kids learn by themselves, why should we be there? You see? Vygotsky makes the point much more clearly. Teachers are here to offer semiotic systems and other resources for the child to learn. But Piaget thought, well, how do you come with offers like that without crushing the child's mind? If you already have the answers, if you already know you have the best semiotic tools, will you leave space for the kids to invent their own way of counting, writing? Then the others say, but if they invent their own way of counting and then don't write it down the same way, they'll never manage to trade one with the other. So it's a very difficult equilibrium between personal creativity and meaning, and as you will say in your own text, the collective meaning, and how can you get to understand the collective meaning? Well, I think you can get to understand the collective meaning only if you are entitled to have your own meaning. If not, you are colonized. If you are entitled to have your own language, your own dialect, your own ideas, your own way of selling oranges in the streets and counting with your own procedures, then if you are accepted and respected in that, and if you become conscious of your own procedures, then you are well equipped for discover that others have other procedures. and to decide yourself which ones suit your life. If you want to become an engineer, you might have to learn other procedures of calculus than the ones that are used in the trade of your father. But if you don't want to be an engineer, what is it that counts for you in your life? And what is it you want to learn? And I think that's something very important. In Switzerland, we have a very strange system for the training on the young people. We call it the dual system. About 60 to 70% of the young people in Switzerland stop going to normal schools at the age of 16 and go in firms to learn a trade with schooling part-time. So they have part-time schooling and part-time working in an enterprise. And they are invited to reflect on their experience at work and in school and vice versa. It doesn't work very easily, but the idea is interesting. And it helps a lot the young people to have an identity. Because when they are in learning a professional vocation, they can tell you, well, I'll be a butcher, yes, I'll be a mechanist, yes, I'll be a nurse. With already some kind of collective identity as a nurse, even if they are in training. In the normal school system, they are usual all over the world, you don't have such a collective identity other than being a student. You have to finish all your degrees to start having a social identity other than students. And that's something that I find very important. Unfortunately, the pressures now on our vocational training is to make it more and more school-like. The pressure is toward making it more academic. And I think the pressure shouldn't go in that direction. It should be going into coaching, not teaching, into discussing the périzvanie of these young people, half in school, half in firms, to boost them in their learning to take responsibilities and initiatives. But the fashion is for formal teaching, so I don't know what will be the next step.
Wonderful. I don't know if you want to address the questions
Yes.
in there.
So I'll take them in the order where they are on the platform. Yes, I think, well, I don't see the name, but the first comment, consider the child as a partner in conversation and not as an object of research, I think is very important. And you could also say, consider a child as partner in conversation and not just as a pupil, not just as someone that you have to train and assess. That doesn't mean that the conversation has no limits. Of course, within the conversation, it's always possible to tell, well, you are, for instance, we had a research on conversation in classroom on pollution. And the teacher was thinking of pollution in the term, you drop things in the street, you don't clean up, at the individual level. But one of the kids had answered on the questionnaire, firms pollute much more than my father's car and the papers we drop in the street. And we could see that the teacher had such an understanding of pollution that she didn't even understand the suggestion of the child. So, but that's normal. A teacher cannot understand every child. She has 20, 30, 40 children. How can she understand what they are thinking about each time? Well, with the conversation, she could be instrumental for that. She could tell the child, why do you tell me that? I don't see the connection. And I'm sure there, the child would have explained. But instead, she didn't do that. She said, please come back to the discussion. but the child thought he was in the discussion. So take the child for a conversation doesn't mean what? Doesn't mean that you don't have as an adult the duty to transmit to the kids what you know and your semiotic tools and your experience. It's just that you don't have to impose it, that it takes all the space. You want it within a dialogue. I had been very impressed when I was a young student by a book written by a French author, whose name is Gérard Mendel, was called Pour décoloniser l'enfant, how to let's decolonize the child. He was a psychanalyst and a Marxist, and in 1971 he published this book in French. I don't know if it has been translated in other languages, and it's a very vivid plaidoyer to look at the child quite differently. With our teaching and education and all our goodwill, are we not colonizing the kids with our own present culture, ideas, battles, and so on? What are the conditions for a relationship to the child that is not a relationship of the colonizer on the colonized? I don't think I was happy with the answers Gérard Mendel gave to all the questions, but the question remained for me as very important. And I have worked also with kids in very difficult social situations, not abandoned, but alone in growing up with parents with violence and so on. And I have noticed that those kids, the only way to help them is to consider them adults. I mean, no, they are kids, but to talk with them as you talk with an adult, in the sense that they are in need of respect, in need of respect for all the experience they already have, that they have to live alone by themselves. You're not going to be here and put them back in a state of infancy, of dependence, when they have nobody to be dependent upon. So, and I don't think it's only for those kids that this attitude is necessary. It's with every kid. If you want the child to grow, you have to respect his autonomy as a person. And then you have your offer, your cultural offers. And you maybe have also the things you require, your requirements for collective lives and so on. But this should be argumented. You have reasons for that. You have to give them. Not act just by authority, but through argumentation. But not just to convince, but to make it a common good. Well, that's difficult because when you're in power, even as an adult, it's easier to just have the answer. And then, yes?
I think Susan was the one to ask this question, Anne-Nelly, and she raised her hand. Perhaps what she meant.
Hello, thank you. Well, thank you. No, it was perfect. And if I may make a comment, what this also made me think is that by not actually offering room for the child to express his or her arguments and points of view, we end up forming adults that are very rigid in their ways of thinking and acting, because that's what they learned, that there's just one way of doing things.
And they learned with a lot of efforts and sacrifices sometimes. They learn, and then you come and say, oh, it's just one possibility. That's, you can't.
Every day we deal with that. It's like somebody tells you a rule, you get, like today I got in line to take my shot, not the COVID, another shot for the flu. And the woman said, no, the line has to go in a different direction because here we're blocking the the handicapped spot, a vacancy. And of course, we understood that, but and then she said, you must go in that direction. And that was underneath the sun. Everybody would be under the sun and not under the tree. And so we said, can we just leave a gap, you know, and stand in line, but leave a gap so that we can still sit under the shade? She said, no, that won't work, because otherwise people will come in front of you in the line. They will, you know, they won't understand that. So you have to go in that direction under the sun. And we were like, oh my goodness, what kind of thinking is that? She only learned that there's one way that the line can go. And it's just one of the very many examples that we have of this very rigid thinking. There's a rule, and that rule must be followed. We can't be creative in coming up with different solutions.
And also, she feels alone in the responsibility of managing the crowd. So she has to manage it, and she manages it her own way. It's not a collective management. It's not used to a sort of consulting each other on how to manage it. She is incapable of saying, oh, the shade, the handicap, how are we going to manage all that? It's not easy. I don't see another solution than going in the sun. And then leaving space for alternative and being capable of listening. But she might be afraid of losing control if she starts listening. I don't know. Well, teachers in classroom, that's how it happens. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And yes, I think also we see that the issues are transformed when they are talked about. And this is development, this is learning. So teachers should not be afraid of opening up discussions that help the children to develop their issues. But you are right, it's difficult for us adults because often we have not received that type of education. So we have to inhibit some behaviors to put some others. Thank you.
It's true, thank you.
There is a very difficult question after from Sarah Bento of how to promote in public schools with adolescents a kind of teaching that is not a colonization. Yes, well, I just don't know. And the only thing I can try to do is to try to identify good examples of good practices. But that's very difficult. In my part of the world, there is just now a strong move into doing philosophy for children with adolescents to open up spaces for discussions. But I think the adolescents also want to have an action on the world. They want to do things, be creators. And there I thought the work from Antti Rajala in Finland, very interesting. He gets teenagers to do, as part of their school works, projects to improve the city. So they study issues with geography, mathematics, and so on, and then go to the city council and discuss with them, for instance, for the bicycles and bicycle through the streets, how could this be helped, or playgrounds or whatever. They take an issue and work with the adolescent issue that they care for and work with them and try to work seriously so that they are seriously listened to by authorities. Francesco Tonucci, he's been translated quite a lot in Spanish. I don't know for Portuguese. He works also with, it's an international movement now of the city of children, getting children to elaborate in a democratic way, of course, supported by adults, their rights and their claims and negotiating them or trying to impose them on and well, these are colleagues who would be much better than I am at discussing how to create conditions for teenagers to develop these kinds of attitudes. But I think you are already doing that with Fernanda.
Gabriela would like to add to this question, Anne-Nelly.
Yes.
Is that okay? Okay,
Yes.
Gabriela.
Good afternoon for everybody here. Well, my question here was just because I was just thinking about what you were saying about rigidity and how people think,
Yes.
and how to teach thinking. That's
Yes.
one of the things we have to also do. But we are dealing with teachers who were not taught, who are not supposed to even argue or to even, criticize or be critical to their school systems.
Yeah.
So that's my question. First of all, because even in the teacher training colleges, sometimes they are taught to reproduce and not to openly create new ways of teaching. Okay. And so it's quite complicated. And this is what I was thinking of and reflecting on, just because I am like at the moment writing my research project. How can we teach that to teachers? How can we help them? Okay. Be creative. How can we decolonize teachers? That's quite an issue. That's quite an issue.
Very difficult because there are also very strong ideological and
sure. That's my idea, because rigidity comes after a long time of, repetitive ways of doing the same thing. And this is what we are facing today when we have to switch over to this kind of remote learning. Okay, so nobody knew what to do because the repetitive way of doing things, the institutional way of doing things, prevented us, inhibit our creativity, or how can we work on this? So everybody's like, reminiscing, when are we going to come back? This is the question we are all saying. So, or is everywhere. And when I think I don't know if the other way we were teaching was good or bad, but it was the one we used to. So the same thing here. How can we help teachers? How can we help educators overcome this difficulty of, be open, and as you say, I don't know, can you teach me? Just to tell a kid, can you teach me?
Well, I have the feeling that when there is emergency, little means, we are tired, the only thing we can do is reproduce whatever it is. And it's better than nothing, probably. Okay.
Sure.
Then within that space, can we isolate smaller spaces in which we give ourselves other rules? For instance, within the lesson of mathematics, can we play a game? But we present it as a game. As a teacher, I had a teacher who used to do that. As a teacher, today, I wasted 2 stupidities. We try to see, well, we teach you plenty of things that are correct, but I will say twice something that is erroneous. And I would like you at the end of the lesson to be able to tell me what were the 2 things that were as a competition. Well, that's a very small game within the larger game. We cannot change the larger game in these situations of emergency, but maybe we can invent smaller games within it that create this distance and these critical aspects. Or we can invent activities, for instance, argumentation. Okay, we are not going to teach history and mathematics and so on, emergency at a distance with argumentation. We don't have the tools for that. But we could have sessions, moments within a session where we say, okay, the numeric system is written like that with 1,000 left, and okay, are there other systems in the world? Okay, you go to the internet, you look, you find other systems. Now, would you have a better proposal? What for? And that's a game in which you can be creative without changing the whole scenery, but you give the opportunity for this kind of perseverance where the child experiences thinking otherwise on a very common daily object of school time. And I think there, with a sort of ludic attitude, you can create spaces for such an experience. So it's said that it's small space and small time, but I think it's so powerful that it doesn't matter. Sometimes it's a small experience. It's good enough to wake you up. It doesn't have to be everything, because if I want to study physics, I'm not going to reinvent physics. But I want the right to stop and say, well, could we think of that in another way? And usually, if we do that, the teacher can find authors, physicists who have explored other ways and give a recognition to my question and sort of put the child who is asking the question of being one thinker among others who also had these questions and tried to solve them and so on. This cannot be done for the whole time of the classroom, but for a moment. In the same way, I liked a lot the text that Fernanda had me read. I don't know if you know it already, with children invited to think about bedtime. Well, the activity around bedtime that she has promoted gave them opportunities to engage into a reflection, expression, creativity, searching, and so on, all sorts of psychological activities that are vital. And if they've done it there, they'll do it by themselves also elsewhere. So within the school space, create niche in which this can happen. This would be my present thoughts on that.
Nelly, actually, they haven't seen this text yet. I'll send it to them.
I recommend it.
You were the first.
I'm the first.
Yeah, we just sent to. It has been accepted, and it's gonna be published. But I haven't sent that one to them. They know others.
So I forget what I say, and you'll have a nice surprise.
I'll send it to them. I'll send it to them.
They'll have a nice surprise. I'm sure they'll like the bedtime. I find it's a very nice example. Or sometimes there is an event, a quarrel between the kids, or a rule that you think is important and they transgress, when it can become an issue to reflect upon. Not just a matter of authority that you have to reinforce, but okay, and then what's the problem? Where are we going with that? What are the alternatives? Well, in fact, we don't have the freedom to choose the alternative here in this school, but when you'll be a teacher, you might, try to recognize them as thinkers and actors, even if here and now immediately they cannot do it. Invent the possible futures, even if they are not enacted immediately. Yeah. And I think in the question from Luciana, who is Luciana?
Luciana is at two places at the same time. She's teaching and just listening to you through Facebook, because now, this time, she has a class. She teaches.
She'll see it later on in the... Yes. Well, I appreciated a lot the questions, and I think this question of the tension between the individual meaning and the collective meaning is very important. But I would like to complexify. It's not only the tension between individual and collective. It's the tension between an individual body who might have already physical problems at the first level, then the individual person who has wills and desires and needs and so on. And then there is the interpersonal. The person is never alone, or almost never alone, but always in relations, affiliated, help-dependent on, and so on. And what are the relationships? Because they organize the meaning. And then, and they can be transformed, but not always, because then there is the institutional level. The sport group or the classroom or the family are institutions, and they regulate the relationships. And then there is the ideological level and the political level that creates the ideology or reinforces the ideology and the institutions. But I think we shouldn't skip the interpersonal relationships to understand what's happening. It's not only individual meaning and collective, it's also interpersonal meaning and intergroup meaning within larger society. That was my thinking about this. And what is she asking also? And then she comes back later on and gave me this nice example of the carnival. And well, there you can really see their bodies. Huh? You don't want to deny it. Yeah, okay. And bodies that you conquer, they're object of conquest. Your own body is an object of conquest, and also the others. And that's already a lot, and it experiences a lot. But that's relational. Of course, you can dance alone, but with an audience or with, but in Carnival, you don't dance alone. And it's relational, and it's part of a group. Which city, which tradition, which company is presenting, and you feel part of a group. And even in the message, Luciana tells me that's a very traditional festival in Brazil. So you see, identity is there. So you really have the body, the person, the relations, the groups, and the larger society that's part of. And if you cannot have carnival because it's COVID pandemia, you know better than me all what it disrupts, which is really the proof that it's a multi-layered reality. So that was my feedback to what I had understood of Luciana's questions. Then came this idea of narratives. Yes, so narratives are very important, but they are not always constructive. The work of the Norwegian scholar called Untitled studied how young people who were marginalized in Norway turned into fascist groups, Nazi groups, in search of identity, in search of a narrative that this group would provide them and they couldn't find elsewhere, and they were not capable of inventing themselves. So I think on this question of narrative, I find very interesting to consider that everybody has a need for narratives, but then there is a problem of which narratives, where do you are granted the narrative, and what are the consequences of these narratives, both on identity, on socialization, and on cognition. And this is linked to power. Those who are powerless will do their best to get power. So it's no use just thinking you can crush them. It's no, it's not possible. Human beings are not like that. And but these questions of narrative, it brings along all sorts of semiotic systems. I thought it was really interesting to see how Untitled dealt with that. And the book from which I had taken the chapter, Aprendizaje e Interacción na Adolescencia y Juventud, where you had the book has a chapter in Portuguese from Untitled on this topic. I also like the work of Sarah Pain. Do you know Sarah Pain from Argentina? She's a psychoanalyst. Oh, she must be 85 now. She escaped from Argentina in the Black years. She studies a lot from a psychoanalytical point of view that you cannot learn if you don't identify with the person who presents you with the learning. And I think that's an interesting hypothesis. Perhaps sometimes you can sort of extract the knowledge from a person you really don't identify, but that's not easy. It requires being with a lot of self-assurance to be able to do that. But the young child learns from those with whom he identifies. And the same with the teacher. So the teacher as a figure of identification is very important in learning. And I'm afraid that some teachers are not conscious of that and disrupt learning because the kids, especially the adolescents, don't manage to identify with them. We had the cases of a teacher in training who was in our course taking our classes and was really in problem because he was failing in the class of youngsters that he had. They were 14, 15, 16 years old. He was teaching literature and he was told that he didn't manage class well. There were students who were rebelled and so on and so on, but he was full of goodwill. And so we tried to accompany him in trying to discover why the students rebelled, why they were mute, or they didn't want to do the homework, or they were nasty, but okay, why? What does this mean? And finally, because we really coach him, he found all sorts of techniques to try to open the dialogue, show his goodwill, and so on. The two leaders of the class were two girls who told him, you want us to discuss the idea of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, you know, the philosopher who preached education open to nature. The children had to be seen as good savages that you have to respect. Those are some nice ideas on the natural contract in education. And these girls told him, you want us to study that, but you are mad. Okay, we had told the teacher, let them go, listen to their emotions, don't worry, we are here to help you afterwards, okay? So he let the things come on, and finally the girl said, he had children, he abandoned his children, and then he wrote this treaty on education, and you want us to learn the ideas of someone who abandoned his children? And that's very important questions. Philosophers have their own answers for that. But teenagers who are growing up with emotions, their own questions, for maybe among, well, statistically in the classroom, there could have been some children with one or the other parents who had more or less abandoned them. So why would they invest into Rousseau's proposals when they couldn't at all identify with him? They were rejecting that figure. And indeed, once the teacher understood that that was the problem of these teenagers, things went much better on in the classroom. Just to give an example. Then someone mentioned Professora Pontecorvo, and that was, it's a very old friend of mine. So if there is some resemblance, it could be because of the dialogue among us. Pontecorvo has studied a lot. She was one of the pioneers in studying argumentation in young children. And she has also in Italy done a lot of work to promote in education, active education, in which kids are learn to have their place and have their word. And so, yes, I understand that you can see some common references behind Pontecorvo and myself, because we do share them. And the same person asked me about emotions. How can we take care of emotions in the analysis of argumentation? Well, I'm not a specialist of that, but there is a very nice group in Lyon, one of the main cities of France, with Plantin, Plantin. He has been translated into English. I don't know if it's to Spanish or Portuguese.
Portuguese too. Yes.
Also.
We have in Portuguese.
Okay. So Plantin did a lot for emotions on argumentation, and he's an emotional person, so you understand that I mean, he experiences what he says. And a younger one, Claire Polo, P-O-L-O, she's now studying, she is developing very precise methods to describe, try to grasp somehow what's happening on the emotional side when kids discuss among themselves or with a teacher in schools. So these would be the references to see how to understand. She's focused just now on what teachers can do with the emotions that are expressed in the classrooms. What are the possible ways to react, to integrate them in the discourse, to not to discard emotions, but to be conscious of emotions and the role they play in argumentation. But they are the specialists. There I wouldn't really know how to do this analysis myself. Oh, and then there's the question on crystallized, colonized thoughts. Well, I think of course, to various degrees, but as soon as we are part of a given group or society or institution, somehow we are colonized, in a sense that we cannot manage to be part of the group discarding all the implicits, because then we are not part. We cannot communicate, we cannot make ourselves becoming part of, or being part of, or transforming it. So there is what I think and Aristotle called endoxa, the shared common ground, the elements we think are shared by the very fact of being together. And I think the role of, well, what is very important is to become conscious of these endoxa. If not, we cannot change them. Somehow we need endoxa, but often there are misunderstandings anyhow. We each understand something we think common and we don't have the same understanding. Sometimes we have the same understanding and we take it for granted, and this colonizes us because maybe it's not adequate. Maybe it takes our power away from us for many reasons. So the problem is, what are the endoxa? Can we do reflexive and maybe even scientific work to unravel the endoxa? And that's what we are trying to do presently in my paper on argumentation with a few colleagues. We have been working now for several years, taking children's contribution in argumentative discussions and trying to understand what are the endoxa behind what they say. It's a window on their world. It's also a window on our world. And for instance, we have an example, I don't think it's in that paper, in which a child is playing a game with the father. And the child is 3 years old, and the father has explained the rules, and they're playing. For the father, it's clear that rules are rules. You abide to the rules. If not, you cannot play the game together. Basic. During the game, instead of picking one card at a time, the child was picking 2 cards at a time, or even 3 cards at a time. Of course, also in situations where it helped her to win. Well, the father, at one moment, said, no, 1 card, then my turn, and then your turn. And he said that 2 or 3 times, and the little girl continued to do it the way she was doing it, with quite a lot of assurance, which surprised the father. And then suddenly she told the father, yes, because in my kindergarten, that's how we do it. If you look at the tip of argumentation, it's argumentation by authority. She plays this way, and now that she's in kindergarten, she experiences different authorities, not only the fathers, and she plays once against the other. That's the game. But it's also very reasonable. Why should I obey to your rules? The father is not the only possible authority. The kindergarten has its own rules. I don't know if it's true or if it's fake. I don't know if really in the kindergarten they were taking 3 cars at a time, or if she invented a kind of argumentation to confront the authority of the father. But the father did not really understand that, and some of my colleagues either, because they thought a game is with rules. And so you discuss the rules. But the child, 3-year-old Piaget would tell you, you can see that in the book on the moral judgment of the child, that a 3-year-old child doesn't understand the concept of rule. The child understands something of the concept of authority. So it's very interesting to look at the argumentation of the child and see that within the experience of the child and at the age the child has, she's doing proper reasoning about the argument of authority. And the adult is in other world discussing rules, whatever that means, rules. So I think not only the people in former colonized countries, but also within the countries that were colonizing the others, we are all colonized in a way, and some more than others. For instance, within my country, those in power, of course, have a larger sphere of initiative that those have been trained in an authoritarian school and are in places of work where they mostly have to obey. Of course, there is quite a difference. But in both cases, there are endoxa that have not been reflected critically upon and that make them play the game they play. So that's why I'm very interested in opening up the box. I take a piece of argumentation and I try to see what is the kind of reasoning that's going on in that argumentation. And with that, we have divided what are the empirical facts or the data on which the argumentation relies, what are the often implicit endoxa on which the argumentation relies, and then what kind of logical scheme is used. Is it a causal scheme? Is it an argument by authority, by causality, metaphoric, by similarity, by opposites? And try to see which logical scheme and on which concrete data and implicit endoxa. And then we start to have tools, I think, to recognize the crystallized thoughts. And these crystallized thoughts stop being crystallized if you recognize them as such. That's our scope. Now, I don't know if we managed to do it, but that's our scope. And just now I'm editing a book, which is made of all the texts that an anthropologist called de Rognier has written. He was in Cameroon. He's French, but he was in Cameroon and teaching French and English in school. But suddenly he realized that he didn't understand his students. And he couldn't go on teaching without some kind of feedback on what was that changing or not in the children's life. So he stopped teaching, got a permission for a sabbatical year, which lasted finally 4 years, to go and learn the local language in a part of the city of Douala and try to understand the background of the students. And doing that, he discovered all the traditional medicine of this area, but medicine in a much wider sense than the Western sense of medicine. Medicine is the art of making the community feel good, repairing the quarrels, giving help, plants and others to those who are ill, trying to fight the evil and the witchcraft that's going on, and so on. And studying all this, he got to part of the roots of the culture of the students that was becoming taboo, because the more they were urban and the more they were schooled, the less they considered that it was okay to talk about these traditions, viewed by the French as primitive and magical and superstitious and so on. And he went deep enough to show that they are not just magical, that they are really a tradition with its goods and its evils, but to help the community keep an equilibrium. And of course, if there are reasons for these equilibriums to be broken, then access to these cultural tools is broken, and what happens? It happens that they still exist, but in a mess. And I think that's something to be thought of. We don't want, with decolonization theories, to reinforce colonization. But there is a risk, because if you tell me we have colonized thought, either I say, well, to some extent I understand, but that's common to humanity in a way. And why would that explain really? Is it really the cause or the unique cause? Or is it also that there are cultural roots that have become taboo or lost with changes in language, of discredit of family traditions, of family modes of education, because the school teaching individualistic mode is seen as prioritarian? I don't know. I don't know, because I have not been in Cameroon and so little in Brazil that I don't know. But here I can see some families in difficulties, because there is a tradition, a rural tradition for many things in child education. But in the last 2-3 generations that have been intensively schooled, the connection to this has been lost. And it's taken as superstitious, but it's not only superstitions. There is knowledge, there is identity, there is ways to means and to make a family and repair a family, make a neighborhood and repair a neighborhood, that get lost in the hyper management of our westernization, or I don't know how to call that. And so that's what, when I read this, that's what came to my mind. And maybe that's why I like so much the paper for which I'm making publicity. It's because it opens the way to step back and reflect. You don't have to abandon your way of going to sleep. You're just invited to either become conscious and enjoy it or change it, but and discovering with respect that others might be doing otherwise and might be experiencing differently, and that growing up you might want to do it otherwise and so on. But then it's not dismissing, it's not colonizing, it's not imitating. Voilà. I think I've managed all the questions, but I don't know if...
Yes, you did. Well, it was fantastic because you managed to present the idea and answer our questions and tackle so many different things. Well, Cristina was asking if she could ask one last question. Do you have time, Anne-Nelly?
Yes, I have. I'm sorry because I exceeded my time, obviously.
No, well, we are Brazilians, Anne-Nelly. We don't expect to end on time.
We are watchmakers, but I haven't looked at my watch.
Yeah, well, we like it. So, Chris, go ahead.
If it's really okay, because for us, actually, we are taking your time, right? For us, I understand it's the other way around, right? We exceeded your time, probably. Yeah. Well, there are many things to talk about, but we kept thinking about this idea of how Piaget's ideas were introduced here, and I think they were misinterpreted when they were introduced here in Brazil. And a lot of the teachers understood they were supposed to just back off and let the students learn by themselves, you know. So they were like, stuff was distributed to them, and this idea of environment that Piaget sometimes poses, that people understood that did not include other people, for example, or include the teacher as well as being part of the environment, for example, right? So and this might be an interpretation of mine, but at the same time, I think that what happens in the long run is that a lot of students didn't learn much and didn't go beyond their immediate possibilities in the process. You know, what happens is that they could have learned a lot more than they did when they were just left on their own. And then we went from having a rigid curriculum in which students were taught and had no voice or anything else to now you do whatever you want, and there was nothing in between. So and obviously we are looking for this space in between, okay? Yeah. And my question to you is based on what we are living right now. Where is there a space for fact, science, and ethics, or it's just about different stories? And this is very related to what I would like to study. In the argumentation, is there a moment in which we stop and say, okay, but because this is what we're living right now, right? We live in a world that it's beyond truth or anything like that. And we live in a world of fake news, and we are living the consequences of this post-truth society, and then nothing is true, and it's I have my truth, you have yours, and it's fine. And so I think we got to the limit of this possibility of this the consequences of this stance that we took. So this is what I would like to know from you. What is your opinion? Is there room in argumentation at school for fact, for science, and for ethics?
There must be room, but there is a precondition, which is trust. And trust doesn't come just because you ask for it. It's something that is being built. And a colleague who is an anthropologist, an American colleague who is an anthropologist, has given me a book to read about a friend of hers who went to some places in the United States where they don't trust the state at all anymore. And when you look at the history they have experienced, their life experience, you understand that they don't trust the state. But then whom could they trust? And there is a problem of having been alienated. They were disregarded by the firms who polluted the environment. They were disregarded by the state that took taxes but didn't care for their streets and so on. But they also unlearned to manage themselves, the community. They don't have the experience of being able to protect their water, protect their forests, protect their home, protect their health, and so on. So there really we have a problem with the intellectuals or those who have inherited the education and are part of formal society. We have a problem. How do we decide to go and reconstruct trust in some parts of society where it is not there, and for reasons that are quite understandable? And I think that's a problem. How a school can, I remember when I was in London with all these immigrant kids coming in, and the British families also scared of all the immigrant kids, and it was not easy at all. I remember once I had gone to school early in the morning because my bus brought me there early, and I met the head teacher, and she told me, oh, you know, for 2 hours when I arrive at school, I have to do social work. Afterwards, I can start thinking about a school. But they have the mother who is in distress. You have the kids who have not eaten. You have, and so on. How do you want me to teach? First, I have to be part of their real life and help them out, and then I can teach them. And this, I remember this very strongly. If people feel lost in their world, they will go and follow those who, that's the problem, is those who pay attention to them, but often to exploit them, not to build the trust.
Mhm.
So it's a difficult problem for teachers to teach if the trust is not there, if they are only representative of negative events. But there, if you think of the 4 level of analysis, there is something that can be built in the interpersonal relationship and move from there on. But it's very, very difficult. It's a major crisis in our society, and falling apart in a way. I mean, yeah, because the modernization, so-called modernization, has has distrusted and destructed traditional ways of living, of thinking, of doing, and replaced them by some kind of anonymized functioning in which those who gain from that, okay, become more active and discover there are large parts of society whose life has improved in the last century. But there are also large parts of society who are not part of that game at all. And so populists can go and pick them up. And we have this all over in small or large quantity, but I don't know. For me, the notion of trust in education is not discussed. The legitimacy of the school and the legitimacy of what teachers require from kids needs argumentation, but not argumentation as I impose and I want to convince you, but as a negotiation with the families and the kids. But it's easy to say, it's not easy to do. That's another problem.
Thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you very much, Anne-Nelly. I think we all had a very good discussion today and learned so much with what you brought to us and how you presented the ideas. I think we will have a lot of things to discuss later about this, mainly our group that works a lot with argumentation, the connections you made and the links to other ideas. I think it was really, really very profitable for us. And now we get to the moment when we take our famous picture. So those of you who want to have a picture of you with us, please open your cameras. Well, I'll take off those who have no camera. Just a second. So let's, with the hearts, 1, 2, 3.
Hearts, what's that?
Below here you have reactions, so there is a small heart.
Bom dia, boa tarde, tudo bem? Como é que você está?
Reactions.
Good.
One more. Okay, 1, 2. All right. So our round of applause for Anne-Nelly. Woohoo! Thank you so much.
Well, thank you to you, and I'm very happy if you're interested in this, so we are a larger community to share.
Yes, and we will, Anne-Nelly, I don't know if I told you, but we are going to transcribe what you said today, the discussions, and turn it into a conversation. Then I'll send to you, and we plan to publish this as a book with all the people who came here. So in Portuguese, we want to do it in Portuguese so that other people can have access to these discussions.
Great. Well, you are courageous. Thank you. That will be a nice gift also for me, because then I can share it with my own colleagues over here.
Yes, that's going to be great. And we already have, Jorgelina has done with some of our colleagues who spoke in Spanish, and we have people in Portuguese as well. So it's going to be a nice way to talk. And the students, they are writing essays, referring to these ideas and presenting their own views on what we've been discussing. So it's going to be a very good conversation that we will keep on having, and we will have a published material that people can also learn from. So thank you so much. I love the conversation. I'll keep talking to you, and I'll send you the pictures of today.
Okay, good.
Okay?
Thank you
very much. It was great.
Thank you to all of you. It was very stimulating. Let's keep in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I've not seen the chat because I'm not capable of reading and talking at the same time.
Okay, but I tried to ask, to take the questions and people who commented the main things to you. So what's going to happen is I'm going to save this conversation and the video, and I will send you the link.
Good.
And then if you want to click it or send it to someone, you can also share it. Thank
Good.
you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. E para vocês, alunos, a Antonieta vai fazer a discussão sobre o essay agora com a gente.
A gente ainda está live, Fê.
Então...
Mas ainda está live.